We are back with Charlie Hoehn. Charlie is like really, I mean, I don't know how to describe what you do better than the guy behind the scenes of really, I mean, some of the biggest launches, some of the biggest names of the last decade plus. I mean, people who you've worked with or talked to in depth, you know, Tim Ferriss, David Goggins, James Clear, Gary Vaynerchuk. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And you and I first met, God, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago, and worked together for a very short period of time. And then we lost touch and then we reconnected. And you sent me an article after we reconnected, after we chatted for an hour about nothing and everything in particular. And you sent me an article about how to sell 1 million copies of your nonfiction book. And very selfishly, what I want to do today is really go through that article with you, because there's very few people who have been behind 1 million copy bestsellers as much as you have. But more than anything else, if you try to sell 1 million copies of something and you hit all the steps right, you might not sell 1 million copies, but you're going to sell a hell of a lot more than what you would otherwise sell. And this isn't just about books. But first, I want to start with a quote. Is that cool?
Absolutely.
This is a quote from your fabulous book. I think it was like 2014 you wrote it, called Play It Away. And part of the quote, this isn't the whole thing, but it goes, "Kids don't run to get into shape. They run to feel the wind in their face and the grass between their feet." I want to know what was behind that quote.
Love it. Yeah. So a few years prior to writing that book, I had just gone through a really rough period of burnout, and I'd never experienced anything quite like it. This was kind of back before people were openly talking about, oh, I have anxiety.
Right.
Like now it's kind of, it's an interesting world. It's like almost a badge of honor in a way.
It got like cool to talk about it for a little bit there, didn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. In 2010, 2011, it was not cool. And I didn't know what it was really. So I went through this period where I thought I was effectively going crazy, and it felt like I was either going crazy or I was like so unhealthy that I could be dying. And it was just really scary. I always felt like I was in fight or flight mode. It suddenly, for the first time in my life, it became very challenging to interact with anybody, whether it was a friend or a cashier. And I didn't want to be around anybody because I felt like it was a contagious energy too. So I didn't want to inflict it on anybody. So it kind of led to more isolating behavior.
What were you doing for work at this time?
Nothing. I had quit two dream jobs in a row. Okay. I had been previously working with Tim Ferriss. And then what happened was, over the span of 48 hours, a family member died. A close friend, one of my best friends, attempted suicide. And then the deadline for this huge project we were working on got extended 6 months. And it felt like, boom, just all these things happened at once. I quit that job. Then I went and worked at an app startup that did really well revenue wise. And like it was a success by all of our metrics. But I quit that because I just still felt like, why am I just so, I'm just not in a good physical or mental headspace.
It almost sounds like you got to the point where you're like, I've achieved everything that young me felt like they wanted to achieve. Why isn't this what I thought it would be like? Why don't I feel how I thought that I would feel like, even though nobody can describe what they think success feels like, right?
Right. It was that. And it was also like, at what cost, And so
okay.
I was like, it was weird because I spent so much time and energy trying to figure out how to get out of that headspace. So I was experimenting, doing therapy, yoga, different diets, different forms of exercise. I was taking every supplement in Whole Foods, and I was doing flotation tanks. I tried psychedelics. I did everything a healthcare professional or an alternative healthcare professional might recommend to you, and none of it worked. And so I was like, man, I don't know if I'll make it through life if this is how I'm going to feel, but I still kind of had hope and faith that I could figure it out. And then I came across this book called Play by Dr. Stuart Brown. And I remember laughing while reading it because it was like, oh, this is it. There were a couple quotes that stood out, like the opposite of play isn't work, it's depression. And play deprivation, or there was this one quote: a lack of play should be treated like malnutrition. It's a health risk to your body and mind. And it just made sense to me because humans are among the most playful species on the planet, and children just effortlessly play, and they play as much as they possibly can. And it just dawned on me that perhaps this was sort of the missing ingredient in my life. And so I started, instead of doing coffee meetings, I would do catch meetings, play catch at the park. And after each one of those meetings, I came back feeling like a weight had dropped, and I felt a little bit better. And so I just started doubling down on that. I started doing improv comedy lessons, which is like it's the relearning of play, I think, for adults is really what it boils down to. It's like all the principles they teach you, like kids know them naturally and do them effortlessly. And within a month of just being systematic about adding play back into my life, I was totally symptom free. And I just felt better than I had in years. And so I wrote about it. I wrote this article called How I Cured My Anxiety, just thinking it was just kind of an interesting thing because I hadn't encountered it in any of the literature except for Play by Stuart Brown. And the post went viral. And for 5 years, if you Googled anxiety cure around the world, it was the top result. So suddenly awesome. this thing that I thought I was like uniquely suffering with and was a huge weirdo about, I was like, wow, there is a tidal wave, millions of people who are struggling with this. And so I ended up writing the book for that reason. And I just think I think the best solutions are often the most simple and the most obvious and the most elegant, and play to me is just like the simplest way to elevate your vibration, so to speak. It's the easy way to get yourself out of fight or flight, because it's, when you meditate, people are like, I'm trying to quiet my thoughts. But what is kind of going on is like your body and your mind have a feedback loop where your body is all of a sudden just like still, and therefore eventually your thoughts just become still. And it's similar with play, where it's like if your body is in play mode for long enough, you're effectively telling it you are safe. You are safe, just over and over and over. And it just worked. And it's very fortunate. It's helped quite a few people as well. So that's where that quote came from.
I love, there's one part of that jumped out at me, which is you were adding all of these things to try to solve the anxiety that you were suffering from. You were adding all these therapies, lists, experts, stuff like that. And I think that's such a common response is addition, not subtraction, whenever we're in trouble. Whereas the reality of it is the cause of our trouble often is that we've just added too much shit to our plate, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I just wanted to point that out. That's been huge for me. Is just
totally
like, wipe it clean, man. Like, you didn't know what the issue was, but you stopped doing everything you were doing and just gave yourself space to breathe, to play. And then you were able to build yourself back up.
Sorry to interrupt you, but it's similar to sleep in that regard. The people who are having health issues, or just aren't feeling totally up to par mentally, it's like one of the easiest things you can do is just prioritize sleep in timing it with the sunset, like just go to bed earlier. Yeah. If you do that for 2 weeks, you will be a totally different person. And it's similar to play. It's like, hey, just step away from the incessant stream of work and email and notifications, and like, just give yourself permission to be goofy and low status. I think one of the negative side effects of becoming an adult or a successful adult is you start taking yourself seriously, and people are like, wow, you're like a sober, professional, responsible person but like, why don't you go give yourself permission to act foolish and stupid and like take away this concept of winning and productivity and moving toward an outcome, and just do the thing for the sake of it, for being in the present moment. And it's very liberating.
There's somebody, Brian Pewitt, that I'm speaking with tomorrow, but he's a part of the summit as well. And COVID-19 to him, like so many other people, completely shut his business. He was producing basically like television shows for Chinese tourism agencies at the time. And so, as you can imagine, during COVID-19, there were not many Chinese tourism agencies spending money on TV shows to encourage Chinese tourists to America. And he was like, well, I don't know what I want to do, but I really like baseball cards. And so he just started opening packs with people and started filming videos talking about his favorite baseball cards. And he's now one of the leaders in that space. He's one of the most followed sports card enthusiast collectors. And one of the things that he said that I can bring up with him is what usually ends up happening with most things we feel shame about in life is that once we start telling people about it and being our authentic self, people love it, man. And it's just this idea of, let your geek flag fly. You will be surprised at how many people are similar to you. And I think that's what you found. Okay, let's get into this how to sell 1 million copies. First of all, this is not just about books. I'm going to make this selfishly about me because The Obvious Choice is my next book that's coming out, as you know, Charlie. But, and I want to sell 1 million copies. But this article is not just about books, right? What I find fascinating about marketing books is that books are products like anything else. And if you engineer the product properly and you build a phenomenal product like any other product, and you launch it appropriately, right? Like any other product, it can take on a life of its own. That's the same with everything. And so these principles are the same with everything. So we're going to talk specific to books, but this is not specific to books. But like you talked about when we were talking more about play, you said the words "at what cost." So I'll ask you, like, is 1 million copies of a book a good goal to have? 1 million copies of a book sold.
Love it. Yeah. So the answer is really, it depends. Yeah. I'll answer kind of very cut and dry at first, and then we can talk more about the emotional and all that stuff. But like,
yeah, for sure.
For a self-published author, I don't think it really matters as much, because for a lot of self-published authors, they look at a book as a vehicle to bring people into their world, their business. And it's very difficult to make a lot of money on the front end. A very small percentage of books sell over 100,000 copies. You're in that realm. A much smaller percentage of books sell 1 million copies.
Sure.
And the most of the money is made on the back end. It's similar to a musician. It's like, do you want to try and make all your money through AdSense on YouTube, or do you want to do tours and merch and like kind of higher end experiences? And like, that's where they make the majority.
Not to say it's not possible, but you're right. I mean, I've sold a few 100,000 self-published books, and I can tell you right now, like, yeah, I could probably live off of it, but not the basic lifestyle I'm accustomed to in Toronto.
Yes. Yeah. And so, especially for nonfiction, if we were talking about fiction, sell copies, like keep writing books, keep churning them out, keep going. Like
serialize the crap out of them, right?
Don't bank on HBO making the next Game of Thrones out of your books. Just sell. But for nonfiction authors have so many different ways of making money. The people who do kind of have to think about it are traditionally published authors, because they're sort of at the VC model. A traditional publisher is giving them an advance. They're betting on them to sell a ton of copies and then pay them that advance back. And so if you, for instance, get $1 million advance, which is, like, given your background and your audience, I don't think is like crazy, right? It's
I did.
possible.
I got a very nice advance. I did not get $1 million advance.
Right. But
For
now I
real.
think you could potentially, if you make the argument, all right. So just for simplicity's sake, a $1
Sure.
million advance, an author gets it, and they have to sell so many copies to make that $1 million back
Sure.
before they start getting paid royalties. Even though those percentages are even lower now because they're a traditional publisher. So their royalty rate is like, I would say a third or half of what a self-published author
I
would
mean, I
be
can tell you
making.
exactly what it is.
What is it?
Royalty rate on the high end is 15% for
Which
traditionally
compared
published
to, yeah, right. Is that for paperback or hardcover?
hardcover.
Yeah.
Hardcover.
Yeah, it's not good.
Paperback, it's less. Paperback is 7.5 to 10,
Right.
whereas self-published, I mean, all get 60% minus the printing cost
Right.
of the book.
Yeah.
So
So it's about a third.
that for a $20 book, that comes out to $7 to $9, and it changes a bit
Yeah.
depending on where they're at. Yeah,
Yeah. So
and that's self-published. That's not
so
convention
2
published.
to 3x basically
Yep.
is how much more you get as a self-published author. So to answer the question, I think, and I also think selling 1 million copies does not necessarily mean you are changing 1 million people's lives,
Yeah,
right? It's
right.
like now you're looking at the conversion of how many people actually read the book, or how many people actually implemented the book, or how many people got past the first chapter, etc. It's like, it doesn't necessarily guarantee it's a transformative book or that it gets into the cultural zeitgeist. What I really admired that I learned from Tim Ferriss, I thought was super interesting. He was like, my goal with the 4-hour work week was to create 1,000 millionaires, which is like,
Okay.
I think that's a more realistic, tangible goal. And it allows you to approach the book in a very specific way that
Yeah.
actually paradoxically increases your likelihood of selling 1 million copies. It's kind of how it's like, if you focus on, like as an archer, if you focus on winning the trophy, you're not going to hit the target. But if you focus on hitting the target, you'll get the trophy, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And he's probably done it. Like, I don't know if he's ever measured it, but he's
100%.
probably done
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But you're right. When you create that goal with whatever your thing is, whether it's a book, whether it's something else, it gives you a very distinct, okay, this is who I'm writing it for, this is their outcome. And when you do that, there's much more focus to it, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
It's Tim. I mean, I've met Tim a few times. I don't know him well, but he seems to me to be somebody who's always asked very good questions,
Yeah.
and that's led to his direction. Like, you even see it. It's just like, you look at the people he interviews on his podcast. It's like, oh, you're thinking about creating a board game because you've interviewed for, whatever board game developers lately. Like, it's very clear what he wants to do and learn at any one point in time because he's able to sit back and ask those questions. Okay, let's get on. Let's get on here.
Well, I will say one other thing that I think
Okay.
is worth saying. I have talked to numerous. This has happened numerous times. I've talked to numerous authors who are. I'm like, what are your goals? And they're like, hit #1 New York Times bestseller list, sell 1 million copies, and get on to Oprah. And I'm like, you know what would be easier? Do 6 months of therapy first, and
Yeah.
then let's see if you still have those goals. Because a lot of them are really about like, can I get the biggest credibility markers for the world to applaud me? And like, and very often it's like, well, it would be weird if I don't know. I'm, for one, I think it's okay to have big goals, but it's also like, but why? But why?
Yeah.
Why do you need to sell 1 million copies? I have not sold 1 million copies of Play It Away. I've sold 30 to 40,000 copies, but I'm glad I did. Like it's a respectable number, but I never think about it. It's just like, it's for the people who read it. I've heard from multiple people who are like, I've read your book 4 times,
Yeah.
and because it gave me a ray of hope, or it gave me a prescription, and like I used it to change my life. And it's like, that's to me not way cooler, but it's like, it's it's enough. It's enough. So,
I think we get obsessed
all
with
that
these
said,
measures, right? Like
what's
there's,
that?
I'm always reminded of Goodhart's law. You familiar with it?
Mm-mm.
Goodhart's law states that when the measure becomes the target, it ceases to be a good measure.
Mm.
And I think about that a lot as it pertains to social media,
Mm.
where everybody says, "Oh, I just need to increase my followers." It's like, why?
Right.
Oh, I need to get more customers. Hey, let's let's not work forward from the solution here. Let's work backwards from the problem. What are you trying to accomplish? Y'all got 3 customers. You need 10. I don't think a few thousand social media followers is going to achieve that, right? Like it depends on your desired outcome. I'm not saying growing social media is good or bad. It's just that depends what that outcome is. And it seems like what you're talking about with the book is very similar. Is what are you actually trying to achieve with the book? And I buy it because I've been through a lot of what you're talking about. I actually never in my life counted the amount of books that I sold until I had to put a book proposal together along with my agent for the most recent book, because this is the first. I mean, I've self-published 11 books. Now I'm traditionally publishing my first book. It was the first time I ever looked at book sales.
I'm with you, man.
It
Same
just didn't
exact
matter.
situation. Yeah. Doesn't
It just didn't
matter.
matter.
Yeah. It's like
Um,
royalties are nice. Getting an extra, however many hundred or a few
yeah,
grand per month is nice, but it's like, it's not life changing money. And there's no direct correlation to fulfillment with those numbers for me
yeah.
necessarily.
There was so when I first started self-publishing, because I'm in Canada, Amazon sent physical checks. They couldn't do direct deposit to Canadians, but every Amazon company is different. So like Amazon Canada, Amazon US, Amazon Deutschland, Amazon Europe, Amazon whatever. So I get like 10 checks a month. And I'll tell you, bringing those things to the bank was super fun every single
That is
month.
cool.
was
Yeah.
was now I just get a direct deposit with all those things. I'm like, oh yeah, cool. Like I don't even look at it, right? As opposed to getting the physical checks and putting them in. That was fun.
Yeah, I like that.
I kind of want them to send me physical checks
See,
again.
I feel like that actually would be a wise move on their part, because then they create this really rewarding feedback loop that would
Yeah.
make their ecosystem even better of like, now I want to write another book. Yeah.
And viral. Like think about what they could do. It was CreateSpace at the time. Now it's Amazon KDP. But think about the virality that they could do if every single author got like some sort of congratulatory note. I always think back to
Mm,
LinkedIn and like the most brilliant marketing thing that they did, where they sent everybody. Spotify does this too to some extent, but LinkedIn did it smarter.
mm.
They sent everybody a badge that was like, "You're in the top 50% of LinkedIn users. You're in the top 30%." It's like, 70% of accounts on LinkedIn are dead accounts. Everybody who's ever logged in the last year is in the top 50% of LinkedIn users, but it still looks good.
Yeah.
And so think about if CreateSpace did that, right? Like, hey, you're in the top 50% of authors. Like they send them like a badge with their check. It's like every single author would now be sharing this picture across their social media, basically promoting Amazon KDP every single month, wouldn't
Yeah, they should totally do that. I know they won't because it's a cost saving measure, but yeah,
That's
well,
great.
yeah, I don't know. They send out so much paper with their packaging anyway, so why
Yeah,
not?
fair. Okay, let's go through these tests. You've got on this article
Hmm.
11 proven tests to maximize your book's potential to sell a million copies. I probably read this article 10 times, but you and I haven't spoken specifically about all the details of this. Test number one, we talked about a little bit, is just like, are you the embodiment of your book? Like, are you your thing? Or are you kind of bullshitting because this is something that you feel like should be there or might sell well, but you don't actually care about? Like what made you? I want to know the story behind that. Is there one story that you can think about
Hmm.
where you were like, this person was the embodiment and it did well?
Yeah, I think the first one that came to mind is David Goggins' "Can't Hurt Me."
Yeah.
So when I worked at Scribe, we published that book, and it really stood out to me when talking to his editor that he was took total ownership of every aspect of who he was and just kind of spilled it out. And yes, it's interesting that he was a Navy SEAL who went through Hell Week multiple times. Yes, it's interesting that he's the toughest man alive, or like, that's his title.
Mm.
But what really makes that book something that, took off was how deeply honest it was about his truth. And I think one of the big mistakes that a lot of authors, a lot of thought leaders, a lot of influencers make is they get on a pulpit and they say, this is how the world should be. This is what you should do. And this is how I think you ought to operate and how we ought to be as a society. And it doesn't work because, for one, with books, at least, you're just talking to an individual. And so it's like, think of yourself at like a cocktail party and you're talking to somebody and all of a sudden you start saying like, we got to do this. You should do this. And it's like, whoa, hey man, like it doesn't work unless you start with yourself and you say, hey, this is what I'm deep, like, this is my truth. This is what I've been through. And oh, if you're dealing with the same problem, or you're wanting to have those similar types of results, here's what I would recommend. Here's what you can do. And so Goggins' book did it really well, where he was like deeply honest about who he was. And the chapters that stand out are the ones where he's just like, this was my childhood. It sucked. My dad was super abusive to me, my mom, etc. And then at the end of each chapter, he typically does, like, he turns it back to the reader and he's like, here's what you can do if you're dealing with similar problems or you want similar kind of results. And so I think Tim Ferriss, he also did it really well in the 4-Hour Workweek. He lays out a recipe for readers to follow, but it's always prefaced with, here's what I did. Yeah. Here's who I am, and he kind of presents himself, I think, in that book a little bit as like, he's just like, wow, he's like a super interesting guy, but he laces in enough vulnerability, honesty, truth that you buy it, and I don't say buy it in a way of like, that's not who he is. It's absolutely who he is. Right. But he's not just presenting himself as like, look at me and how interesting and awesome I am. There's a lot of truth there.
It sounds so. My goal in life that I joke about is that I want to be a disgruntled author in a basement drinking bourbon, complaining to people that they don't appreciate my genius. And I feel like I actually achieved step one of that goal on Saturday night. My wife had the kids overnight at her mom's, and I went to a pub and drank a beer and wrote until 11:30 at night. And so step one complete. But one of the things that I did, which is so interesting you said here, is I changed all of the U's to we's in the book. And I found that forced me going, because I was editing, I wasn't like actually writing. What I found that did is I found that forced me to call myself out on my bullshit, where I was, because it's that idea of like, you should do this, you should do this, you should do this, versus this part where I'm talking about this thing isn't actually true to me. This is just stuff I read in other self-help or business books that I think sounds nice. But it's not my experience. It's not what I can offer uniquely to this world, to this market, to this idea. And changing it to we, you always hear that advice, like change all your I's to U's, like make everything about the reader. I actually am now kind of, hey, what if we change all the I's to we's? Maybe if we change all the yours to ours. And that brings it to, this is for kind of people like me. Like David Goggins has never been for me. I haven't read his book. I've never looked at his thing and been like, yo, I resonate with the guy. I see it. I get it. I get why other people do, but it's not for me. But that's cool. It's for millions of other people. And that's the entire idea, isn't it?
Yes. And I think historically, the majority of big best-selling books do speak to you. and not we, because you're addressing the individual.
Mhm.
But it's interesting to use it as kind of an editing filter to see like how much of this is truthful, how much is this
Yeah.
in my experience. And this goes to like speaking too, by the way, which is I I've been a professional speaker, I guess, for a while now. I've
You're a
gotten up to a
professional
place
speaker.
where
You don't need bunny ears. You're a
well,
professional speaker.
it's not like my full time gig, so
Yeah.
I kind of am like, yeah, when it comes in. But I've gotten up to a place where I'm like, okay, I know I'm good now, and I know I can, like, I know my value and what I can charge. But an interesting thing that's happened is over time, there's been less and less sharing of other people's work, and more sharing of like, hey, this is just my experience. and
Interesting.
I've, and so I've just found that fascinating of like the more comfortable I've gotten, the less I'm depending on other things, outside sources of other people's truths. Because and it's a good advice of like, you don't even know if what you're sharing is accurate, but what you do know for sure is your story, your truth.
Right.
And so like I'm with you on David Goggins. It's not really my style either. I only read, I think, the first third of that book, but I understood why the draw. I got it.
Yeah.
I think there's an absence of like kind of masculine figures in our culture. And so when there's one who presents themselves as kind of this ultimate, it's like a lightning rod. I think Jordan Peterson tapped into something too, where like
Hmm.
young men can kind of look up to and aspire. Obviously, women find inspiration in Goggins as well, but I think it's just very heavily skewed male, if I had to guess. But in any case, yeah, I'm a big believer.
He's kind of like stepped over into the general zeitgeist in your
Yeah,
words now, but where it started was, now he's just like a name, so it might
mhm.
not be representative. But yeah, his core audience in the start was probably very heavily skewed male. I
Yeah,
would agree with that.
yeah. So just to wrap up this one, I think if Naval Ravikant says productize yourself
Mm.
as like the business move, and I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think people don't feel that their truth is enough, and so they seek external sources of like, how can I pad this with better stuff? But it's not better. It's like, we just want your truth. That's it.
Yeah, yeah. It's not that. It's not a worry of being authentic. It's the worry that your authentic self is not enough, isn't it? And then
Yes.
as we get more confident, as we get more, call it social proof, or as we just see more, get more experience, and also get more evidence for the stories, then we need to rely on those external validations a little bit less.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
sounds like.
That's why I tell authors who are like, I want to sell 1 million copies, hit bestseller. I'm like, you might want to do some therapy first, because you got to
Yeah.
realize like after you hit those, you won't hit those benchmarks first off. But if you do, you're still going to feel the way you feel, which is I'm not enough. And that's where this is coming from.
I every once in a while, this is just like my stupid Jewish sarcasm, but every once in a while I'll just put on Facebook some like dumb joke. And the other day I wrote, I just hit 200,000 followers on Instagram. I used to think when I got there it would make me happy, but now I know that when I hit 300,000 followers I'll finally be happy.
Yeah, the goalpost keeps moving.
Yeah, it keeps moving, man. So, I mean, test number 2, is your book insanely valuable? There's a question that you asked there, which is your book insanely valuable in every single chapter from start to finish?
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough. It's
That's
it's
tough.
a high benchmark, but it is one we're striving for. When I was working with Tim Ferriss and editing the 4 Hour Body, he would
Yeah.
ask like, uh, "Which all right, now which chapter would you cut? All right, now which chapter would you cut? Like, if you could only leave 70% of this book, what 70% would you leave?"
Just
And
constant.
right. So it's just like trim it down so there's zero fat. And there's a lot of fat in books. It's very difficult to write 70,000 words and have it all be essential. It's very difficult.
Ask me how I know. Yeah.
Right? Yeah, it's damn near impossible. But if you can do it, I think if, just as a geeky side note, if you really do need to hit a word count in order to pad a book, just lean into storytelling. You can still transmit the information, but it makes it so much more enriching, and like you can really string it out.
I was pleasantly surprised. Yeah, I think I told you a little bit about the process that I went through, but there was an auction for my book, and there was a bunch of just incredible publishers and editors who were interested. And I was very pleasantly surprised, when I asked them a bunch of questions. It's a weird kind of meeting because like they're selling themselves to you and then you're selling yourself to them at the same time. And neither person is quite sure like how sold the other person is. It's a weird kind of thing. But I asked them what they view as a word count, or if they like certain word counts. And I was actually surprised at only one of them said, we like our books to come in and around this specific 65 to 80,000 words, I think is what they said. All the other ones said some iteration of as short as possible, as long as necessary. There's best-selling books at 40,000 words. There's best-selling books at 120,000 words. And
Absolutely.
it does not need to hit a certain page count so that the spine is a certain thickness to sit on shelves at a bookstore anymore. And so that seems to have changed now.
It's wonderful
where,
to hear.
My book will probably come in 55 to 65,000 words. But, I mean, my editor is just like, we're going to make every word count.
Yeah.
That's what matters.
Yeah. That's great.
So I was happy to see that.
I think
talk about the idea of, go on.
Yeah.
Go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, I like to think, I kind of like to remind myself with nonfiction books, you're creating an obstacle still. Like the book is an obstacle to the outcome that the person ultimately wants. It's just like, can you make the journey as valuable and interesting and entertaining as possible? And so it's good to hear that publishers have abandoned the old notion of like, we need a certain spine thickness, because that literally is where that comes from.
Yeah.
But yeah, as short as possible, as long as necessary, is wonderful advice. Yeah.
That idea of the obstacle is an interesting idea. I'd love to dwell on that a little bit. Like your product is not what you're selling. What you're selling is the end result of your product that the person buying your product feels like they want. That might even not be what you know that your product gives or what you think your product gives. Like they're buying it for some desired end result in their head, which is often very different from two different people buying your same product. And if you look at your product as saying, this is actually an obstacle to them getting to where they want. It's an interesting scene change. I've never actually heard it described that way.
Dude, I mean, if people could take a pill instead of read a book, they would. Absolutely. Yeah. It's faster, it's easier, it's less painful. Books to a lot of people are still, it's like homework. Most people are not readers. And so, it's like, can you exceed their expectations in the delivery of this book? And can you make the perception of the investment of time and energy into reading it and implementing it as pleasant and efficient as possible?
It's a really interesting way to think about it. I gotta think about that one a little bit more. Talk about making your book accessible to the masses, because that's one that I think about a lot. Of, hey, I mean, this event is called The Obvious Choice. My book is called The Obvious Choice. My podcast is about the obvious choice, and the entire philosophy is it's way better to appeal specifically to a smaller amount of people where you're the obvious choice for them, than to be a just okay or just good choice for a whole bunch of people who don't really care about you. Well, with books, that's not really the case, though, or is it? Like, Goggins is perhaps an interesting example of that.
Right. So if we're talking about appealing to the masses, in other words, in order to get to 1 million copies, you do kind of have to appeal to the masses in any number of ways. Yes. But I agree with you. I fully agree with you of can I make this book the obvious choice for a small segment of society where they're like, this is awesome. And so, and by default, like selling 1 million copies, that's still 1 out of 300 people in America. You're not
Right.
the masses. Like, so the
And that's
masses
a
may
million
even be the
copies,
wrong
like
terminology.
across all formats worldwide. Like you speak
Yeah.
to, I mean, you know more people who have sold 1 million books than I have, but I know a few, and they'll be the first to tell you. They're like, I didn't sell 1 million paperback books in the United States.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know?
Totally. Totally. So that's my point though, is like 1 million copies, bear in mind, is 1 out of 300 people in the United
Yeah.
States. That's 0.3%. So it's not like everybody is going to be familiar with your book, but making it accessible to the masses, there's a handful of things. So you touched on one of them, is like, is it available in every type of media, right? Because you have
Right.
different types of readers. Do they want to hold it? Do they want it on a Kindle? Do they want to listen to it? Do they want to watch it in some way? Do they
Huh.
want bite-sized social media clips? Like, that can eventually lead to them buying your book. But I think there's also like recognizing how people consume information, what it triggers up in the brain. So I think like this really interesting piece of advice for a first chapter of your book that I read that I really liked was like, does it evoke terror or greed? So in other words, like, does it hit the part of the brain that the reader's like, I'm terrified, and so I need to pay attention to this threat? Or does it make them be like, I really want this? This is like
Right.
novel, and I really want this. That's primal, man. Like and I think using storytelling, that's how all of our brains are optimized to intake information. I think a huge mistake a lot of authors make is neglecting story in favor of like getting out as much information
Mm.
and as much knowledge as they can. And then like, yeah, this is one I'm dealing with in editing a book I'm working on right now. Is it free of jargon? Is it so simple that a 10-year-old
Right.
could comfortably read it? Because not because your audience is 10-year-olds, but because most people read at a fifth grade reading level,
Yeah.
for better or worse. That's just the reality. And so you want it to be something that they can sit down and read start to finish and not feel like, what? As soon as you get to a point of confusion or complexity for the reader, that often is enough for them to be like, you know what, screw this. I don't even know what he's talking about anymore. And so I think it's really important to go through an editing process where you're reading it out loud, so you
Mm-hmm.
know that it's conversational, but also you're using beta readers to find which parts are confusing and boring. In other words, like, where are they like, I'm done. You want to create a book that has enough narrative momentum that they can get all the way through it and they're like, that was great.
I have
Like,
a good
that's the
example of
ideal.
this. I was on the subway earlier today. Just went to meet somebody downtown. And there was an advertisement on the subway that was looking for participants in a research study. And so it was a research study for some herbal remedy to help you stop smoking. Okay. And so, there's a big headline. It's like, do you want to stop smoking? We are looking for males or females 18 to 65 who smoke at least a pack a day, who smoke at least every day and drink. And then in the line underneath it says compensation available. And I was like, what if you change that line to we will pay you money?
Right.
Like, who are you talking to here, right? It's just, and even the headline of the thing, like, do you want to quit smoking? It's like, do you want to stop smoking and make money? It's just, but to me, that was just such a, it's such an like, clearly the academic running the study ran the subway ad, which was so interesting to me of just, why are you using the word compensation there? And when
Yeah.
you're
Yeah,
going through a
totally.
book, a beta reader would have caught that. What questions I've heard Neil Strauss talk about this a fair bit, and it's always been something that I've been interested in. What questions do you ask a beta reader? Because the issue is if you ask people for feedback, they're going to give you feedback, and most of the feedback is going to be useless feedback. Because if you ask people their opinion, they're going to give you their opinion. And
Mm.
how do you validate or invalidate what it is? So how do you navigate? How do you choose your beta readers? How many? How do you what feedback do you ask them for, and then what do you do with that? I'd love to
Mm.
know that process.
Yeah, totally. So
Again, totally
I wrote
selfish.
about this. If you look up my name plus beta readers, I did write
Ooh,
a
I'm
post
going
about
to.
how I went through this, but it boils down to you want them to point out what they don't like, what is wrong, what's not working.
Yeah.
Yes, it can be helpful to like also hear about what is working, you know, and it just as a creative, you want to get a bit of positive reinforcement there, but like really focus on what is boring, what is confusing, what do they
Mm,
roll their eyes at, you know, because
okay.
everybody has cringy stuff in their early drafts. Everybody has stuff that's very confusing or totally boring and not interesting. I've never come across an author who's like just nailed it straight out the
Yeah.
gate. It doesn't exist. So you really, I would not ask for advice on how to fix it though, because only you will really know how to do that. And I think for me, I got as many quality beta readers as I could, and the kind of bars I used were like, is this a book that, based on the description, is this a book that you need? Is this a book that you would like desperately want to read? I think it's just like, yeah, for those people that like, especially a book about anxiety where their attention's frazzled. Like I wanted people who are like hanging on every word basically.
Mm, okay.
And then others, it was like, I had quote unquote beta readers who were best-selling authors, people who like knew the craft of writing. And so I just kind of had a blend, but it was mostly people who are like, yeah, this is my target audience, I want them to read it. And I took all their feedback as like I paid close attention to the stuff that wasn't working, and the best edit that was made in the book came from a beta reader who was like, you know, kind of come across as like an entitled douchebag in the first chapter, but the second chapter I really liked you. Like I
Yeah.
related to you, and I just flipped those chapters and the book worked.
Right. Right. Here's the voice that I want.
Mm-hmm.
That's useful. That's one. Yeah. I mean, I have your article up. I'm going to have a good look through it where you crowdsourced your editing. And
Mm-hmm.
I love that too because you're involving your community in the
Yeah.
creation of this thing. Now it's not your thing, it's our thing,
Mm-hmm.
which I really, really love. Um, that's really useful. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
The idea of hey, what's boring, what's cringy, what do you roll your eyes at, what's confusing, is great. Do you ever ask people like, is there anything you really loved?
Oh yeah, totally.
Okay.
Like I said, you want that positive reinforcement, and you do want to know, like, okay, this is really working.
Mm,
Interesting. Like this is where people lit up. Wow.
yeah.
Okay. Because that's valuable too. Um, and yeah, it's you want to stay motivated during the editing
Yeah.
process for sure. But I just really focus on. I think I'm of the belief you can't really over edit. Like if
Yeah.
like you could keep making it better, 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 better. You want to stop when you hit diminishing returns, but it's yeah. Take your time in the editing phase. I think it's so important.
Final thing I want to talk about.
Yeah.
I love the line timely yet timeless.
Mm.
How the hell do you make something timely yet timeless, though? You need to hit into what people are thinking about today, but
Hmm.
you can't make it too much about that because then, I mean, my book's not going to come out till January 2025. I don't know what people are going to be thinking then. I know people are still going to be scared about a scary technological future, but I mean, I don't know what people are going to think about that. But it's still got to be timely yet timeless. How do you think through that? Is that just like central themes? How do you do that?
It's challenging, right? So my wife and I were just talking about Cards Against Humanity and
Yeah.
how it kind of it became the top selling product on Amazon for a stretch over everything. And it was kind of, I was saying it was kind of in the same zeitgeist, I thought, as The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F by Mark Manson.
Yeah.
And that book sold crazy amounts too. I think it's
And it was
well over 10 million. And
it's 15 plus or something now. But what was crazy was how quick that book sold that many copies.
yeah, yeah,
That
yeah,
was the crazy thing. You know, you think like Atomic Habits is catching up to Subtle Art, but Atomic Habits only sold a few 100,000 in its first year.
right. Yeah.
Subtle Art was just like was just
Yes.
exploded out of the gate.
Because I think it tapped into the timeliness, the cultural zeitgeist of the time, which is similar to Cards Against Humanity. Is there was just, I think, this growing audience of people who were like, we're tired of the same old stuff. Like it defined itself as the anti self-help book, you know, where
Right.
and I think you could define Cards Against Humanity as the anti board game or the anti you know, typical card game, however you want to describe it. And so I think it's like when there's like a huge saturation of everybody going in the same direction, if you can zag instead of zig, that's potentially very effective, potentially. I think there's also, like, to go back to Tim's 4-Hour Work Week, I think prior to that book coming out, think of some of the top selling or the top movies: Office Space, Fight Club, American Beauty, all have the exact same setup and premise as the 4-Hour Work Week,
Interesting.
which
Yeah.
is a guy who is unhappy with their corporate gig, deeply spiritually unfulfilled, quits in a blaze of glory, and goes on to either start a fight club, like work at a fast food restaurant, and, you know, just like goof
Or
off and smoke
sell
weed.
supplements online.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So it was really fascinating to me that it was just a reflection of what's going on in society. So right now, if you look at the song, I think I forget, it's like Rich Men North of Richmond,
Yeah,
that
yeah,
had
yeah.
50 million streams in 2 weeks. And it's probably more, 50 million views on YouTube. So it's probably like 100 million with Spotify
The
and
first
other
ever
stuff.
song to hit #1 on the Billboard charts without any previous song hitting any chart anywhere
Right.
by that musician. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And it's like he hit a lightning rod of truth where, like, just like what I described with the 4-Hour Work Week and all those movies, everybody is so tired of pretending things are not that bad. And there is a deep um feeling that people are desperately unhappy about and they feel trapped by. It's the status quo, which is like, why are we pretending things are great for so many people when so many people are struggling and angry about these issues? And so when he tapped into that timeliness of that truth, it exploded. And I think that song also has a sense of timelessness to it,
For sure.
where it will stay as somewhat of an anthem of things are not as they should be, and we're tired of it.
So it's these timeless problems that are always going to continue. I mean, things are not as they should be. Like the whole theme, or what was the "Make America Great Again"? Wasn't that the exact same presidential slogan like 30 years earlier or something like that? Like that's
I
been
think it was "Make America Great."
I
Yeah.
think like that slogan has been used like at least two like multiple times.
Mhm.
And it's a similar theme. It's things are not there are a lot of us that believe that things are not as they should be.
Mhm.
At any one point in time, maybe that's more present,
Mhm.
maybe that's
Yeah.
less present, but that's always there. Well, Charlie, this was wonderful, man.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Can
doing
I
this.
just say one last thing about this?
100%.
Because I really like this concept as well, which
100%.
is like giving some thought to the last sub question I asked in this, which is, will your book be relevant and useful for a minimum of 10 years?
Yes.
If you imagine your kids or your grandkids reading your book and being like, this is exactly what I'm going through. I think you're just setting up your book for like, okay, there's a sense of timelessness here. You know, this isn't just a flash in the pan. This is going to be useful for a long time. And so you can take cues similar to Mark Manson's super timely book. He wrote about Buddhism, you know, so these concepts are going to stay. And so you can tap into what the cultural zeitgeist is at the moment, which his was very, hey, let's talk about social media as the problem. We give too many F's because we're just constantly showing our lives and we have FOMO about other people's lives and all this stuff. And then he grounds it into a timeless solution. So that may be a way of thinking about it. What are the current problems and what is the timeless solution?
Yeah. And those things, I mean, this idea of 10 years, you know, getting into the Lindy effect, if something has been around for 10 years, it's going to be around for longer. Like the odds that it will be around for longer every year past 10 years goes up exponentially, right? What's that, in the Seem to Lead thing, I think, isn't it?
I can't remember first, but yeah, I mean,
came up with that. But,
yeah.
But I've seen it to be true. I mean, I talked about Brian with sports cards and baseball cards. And I was listening to an interview with him, and somebody said, you know, do you think this hobby is going to go away? And he's like, this hobby has been around for 120 years. It ain't going anywhere. For some reason, people really like pieces of cardboard with other people's faces on them. Like, that ain't going anywhere, man.
100%. Yeah. You know, like, I think about, so to expand this a bit beyond books, I think about my buddy Jesse Cole's baseball team a lot. Yeah. He's the owner of the Savannah Bananas. And, you know, baseball's been around. Yeah, he's awesome. Baseball's been around for over 100 years. And it's been an oversaturation of boring forever and no rule changing and tradition. And it's like, we live in a totally different world now where you can have entertainment on demand and people don't have short attention spans. They have higher standards of what should happen moment to moment. And so he changed things up and he did that. And he made something totally timely that is timeless. Baseball will be around forever, but he modernized it. And as a result, it is like among the most successful sport teams on the planet now.
That's
a collegiate, insane. What started as a collegiate baseball team is selling out all over the country.
I remember going on a hike with Jesse, and this is like 6 years ago, and he was like, I have this crazy idea for something called Banana Ball.
That's awesome.
And he was telling me about it, and I was like, that is fucking brilliant. Because he asked me, he goes, you know, I was talking about baseball. And he's like, oh, you're a baseball fan. Right? We were at dinner the night before or something like that. I was like, yeah. He goes, how many games did you go to last year? I was like, I don't think I went to any. He goes, you see what the problem is? It's like, you define yourself as a baseball fan, yet you are spending $0 on baseball. All right, Charlie, this is wonderful, man. I could talk to you for hours, but we got to cut it here. This was about books, but this was not just about books. And it was somewhat selfish on my end, but I hope that other people really, really got a lot out of it the way that I did. And so thank you. I can't wait to talk to you soon. Really appreciate you doing this, man.
My pleasure. Always fun talking to you, Jonathan. Thanks again for having me.
Absolutely, man.